Hello and welcome to another episode of the Testing Peers. Tonight you have the original crew all together. So let's say welcome to Chris.
Buenos dias.
Who has changed nationality. Simon.
Hello.
And David.
Hiya.
And I'm Russell. Before we go into this week's topic, let's just give a quick announcement from our sponsor, Saffron QA. They continue to be our sponsors, which we're really grateful for. They've also here to help the testing community. And should any of our listeners be in the market for a new job in testing or hiring new talent into their teams, please reach out to Ben. You can be contacted at ben@saffronqa.co.uk, and that will be in our show notes too. This time we're going to talk about fighting fires. Before we fight fires, let's fight Chris's banter. So, Chris, over to you, sir.
Well, obviously, listener, as you're listening to this, as the episode drops, it is bonfire night in the UK, which means we have many fires and many fireworks. But I'm not going to go all Guy Fawkes because that would be too predictable. So instead, let's talk memes. Has anyone ever seen that everything's fine meme with a dog in the burning down room just drinking? Have you ever used that in the workplace? Because perhaps you're trying to survive whilst fighting fire. Maybe there's some GIFs and some memes that you use in the workplace. Maybe actually not when everything's in a terrible state. But have you got some go-to memes or GIFs that you like to use?
I can start you off here. Mine's always the kind of Homer Simpson. Is it Homer or Bart backing into a hedge?
Oh, Homer, yes.
Yeah, I think that's the one I often throw a kind of grenade over a fence and then just back away and see what happens.
Mine is a wrestling one where Bryan Danielson in his current form is just shouting yes, 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 and we sort of send that as a celebration every time we actually get a win within our team.
Mine is one of Mr. Bean. I don't think I need to say much more.
In what context, David?
Yeah, is he putting a particular face? This will be podcast gold, by
as
the
long
way.
as he's not using the hand dryers in the toilets in the film.
There's the one there's the one in his movie where he's flipping a bird to everybody in the car. He doesn't realise
it's not that one either. It's just him pulling a funny face. So yeah.
My positive one would be Barney Stinson from How I Met Your Mother saying, "I request the highest of fives," as a sort of like, you've done something awesome and I want to shout it out. See, good and positive. See, we don't always have to just use them for sort of comedic purposes to sort of say everything's burning down, but we're somehow still here. But listener, sometimes we really are. And so we're going to talk a little bit about fighting fires, which I think all of us have experienced at different times in our lives. Not actual fires, but things that feel like they're sort of disasters and we just kind of have to survive a little bit and constantly have to prove ourselves and other pieces. Has anyone got any particular way they think they want to kick us off? Well, listener, unfortunately, that means you have to listen to Chris speaking for just that little bit longer because everyone just shook their head. Isn't that a shame? Thankfully, Chris likes talking. So, listener, I once was testing a computer game and I joined a project as they were at crunch. And crunch period in the games industry basically means you just work and you're fed takeaway for what feels like a relentless length of time. For me, it was about 3 months of working 30 hours overtime a week. We were basically tasked to find any issues that would be found by compliance checks to ensure that those bits were fixed. But anything to do with usability, fun, enjoying the game, they were all completely swept under the rug to the point where the developers were actually fixing the issues that were the low-hanging fruit and not the actual major problems. And so, listener, what happened was bugs were being raised and hidden from the development team. And they had a completely separate database and people were only picking those things. There was a very low level of transparency. There was very low amounts of trust. And it kind of felt like we were all wasting our time. It's not quite fighting fires, maybe, but it was an utter disaster.
Doesn't sound fun, that's for sure.
No, I actually got stuck in bed and couldn't get up after that sort of 3 months of overtime and got signed off work for a week as well.
I remember as a consultant for an unnamed place working on a new exciting opportunity, and it was to validate a banking system for a new bank. And it was to do that to make sure that their authority in the US was happy with them and all the audits would pass. And to do that, I think it was in about 3 months. I think it was actually somewhere like 6 weeks. But reality turned out to be 3 months they needed. and it was going from 0 tests, 0 information, 0 requirements to complete everything. And then I think the system was going to be ready to test after the date we had to finish, which was just, that's proper on fire. As far as I'm concerned, you're not going to get the system until, say, September, but you need to finish in August. I'm trying to explain that to somebody. That was fun.
When you talk about fighting fires, the scenario that comes to mind for me is more about issues being found once it's released, and suddenly that mad panic around the office that everyone needs to double down on focusing on fixing the issue. I've been involved in a few of those with varying levels of organisation and panic at different levels, whether it be, C-suite people have got involved saying this has to be fixed now, what are you doing, why did this happen, all the finger pointing, while the doers are actually running around trying to solve the problem, while the managers all discuss whose fault it was. And then I've had other ones where there's been a lot more of a calm around, okay, don't worry, we'll just work and solve the problem, and we just broke into teams and collaboratively solve the issue. Both could be classed as firefighting, whereas one is more of a desired approach, whereas one is just that hand flapping panic, everything's fine, we're just going to carry on with it and work through it. So, I mean, they're the two examples, and I think we've probably all got examples of that happening that we could talk about.
There's one example. So I worked for a home automation company, and as a benefit, people was able to take the things home and put them around their house. And I remember one particular day, one of our executives came in and went, "Oh my God, system's breaking down. Half my stuff disappeared." So we spent half a day looking at it. Some people even went to his house, and they realized that actually what had happened is he switched off one of the plug extenders. And so therefore he wasn't able to extend to the hub. So in his mind, it was a complete disaster, but actually it was user error that caused the panic.
We've managed to quite interestingly cover quite a breadth of sort of root cause for some of these fires, right? Some of them are people, some of them are human error, some of them are a fixed deadline. Do we have anything else that's different, or anything that presses into that, or should we start talking about how the hell do we get past that sort of situation and what lessons we learned?
The other scenario that I've experienced, and I've experienced this quite a lot recently, is the fires that happen when collaboration doesn't happen. So where you get parts of projects moving forward with other parts of it not talking to them and being left to sort of in the wilderness. And a couple of those is when the QE function have gone, guys, hello, why are we not included yet? Then suddenly there's a panic a month later. Why do we not involve QE? Okay, we need to get them involved. And then suddenly we're trying to retrofit any kind of testing strategy plan execution phase to a project that's already half baked. And that can be another form of panic and frustration and firefighting within their department, because you're not engaged as early as you could have been, and therefore you're having to retrospectively try and work out how to provide value and not go over cost, not cause problems for the project, and that constant fear of cost being an issue.
I've got a few similar ones to Simon's there, which is around that engagement at the wrong time, like having gates at the end and not actually looking what you need to do until you hit them, and then suddenly having to retrofit things to please somebody, like a pen test suddenly needs to be organized last second, or just disorganization for dependencies and standards.
And with that, the fire that happens when a pen test at the end suddenly finds something, or a performance test that's done just before release. Oh, we realized we're 20% slower than we were before. Yes.
Yeah, the other one I think for me is like things aren't working very well in the team or an area. You're asked to come in to help because they're struggling to deliver to their timeframes or to a need, and then coming in and finding out that actually it's kind of like polite phrasing it of cowboy hour. Everyone doing their own thing in their own way. Often consultancies potentially doing things in what they think is best practice, but not necessarily in the same standards of the organization, or other consultancies are also in the mix.
That directionless approach where everyone's doing their own thing.
Yeah. A dev team doing their own thing, but then a test team working completely independently of the dev team. Again, if you set the right projects up, some of these patterns aren't the world's worst. It's just usually they're not done in the right context to make them successful. They're done haphazard, bad communication, and so on. So yes, they've all caused fires. Communication
is quite a recurring theme.
I was going to say communication's really important. Making assumptions. I've been guilty of the past of making an assumption and thinking that a bug is far worse than it actually is, and actually escalating it and then going, no, that's not going to happen in the real world. We're not going to do it. And there's a bit of disappointment there, because actually it feels like it should be more important than it actually is. That's the way.
You know what they say about assumptions, don't you, David?
What's that, Chris?
Well, when you assume, you make an ass out of you and me.
Yeah.
Very original.
Oh, non-original at all. It's from the playbook.
To your point there, like some of the times, like a couple of examples, David, is assumed things where we think it's more impactful, or someone reports all systems down. Like I've had those before. And then you realize, actually, no, it's just a part of a function. It's not working. Or if you happen to have an expired password, or then you can't log back in because it's forcing you to reset it. Or someone's claiming the end of the world when it's not really the end of the world. And I think there was a talk by Heather Reed at Test Bash that was really good because it used data and went into this sort of experience. I'd recommend if you get a chance to watch it, because it'll be available on Ministry of Testing soon, I'm imagining, if you have a license.
Oh, links in the show notes, guys. That's what we need to make sure that we have.
Indeed, yeah.
It's interesting, though, how data can drive decisions, because you can start seeing something that's, like, if something is really, really on fire, your phones literally light up like a Christmas tree, or your chats does, and so on. Your social media
or your monitoring dashboard would show up.
Like exactly.
Bright red lights if it was working properly.
But sometimes it's hard to see how bad it is, because just a 50% uptake in people calling doesn't mean the world's gone to hell. It just means there's a big problem. It doesn't tell you the world is stopped. You know what I mean? So you've got to use data to try and make sure you don't panic. And actually do an assessment.
And that's the context thing as well, right? If you understand what the actual impact of the thing that's gone wrong is, were you to have adopted something like a risk storming, to have understood your sort of impact and things to particular demographics and stuff up front, then you've got a bit of a clearer picture and you can be more pragmatic in your approach for these things. Like you say, data sort of informing those things. Are there workarounds? Are there mitigations in place? And there's all these good things that happen. And I think how you, or indeed your culture, reacts in the face of crises like this can be quite telling and can really change your mood. Some people obviously thrive in a situation, they stay calm and they know exactly what to do. Some people feel utterly directionless and forlorn. Some people take the weight of the world on their shoulders. How have you typically reacted in these situations when you've been fighting fire and as a leader found yourself having to sort of set a tone?
I would say I've actually learned a lot from working in a company where the IT technology is not the primary product in that respect. So, for example, working for an airline, a crisis doesn't necessarily mean an IT system failure. A crisis can mean a war. A crisis can mean there's a crew shortage in a certain base, which means we can't fly in or out of that base. And that's, therefore, IT have no issues. So you then sit there as part of the crisis team watching how that plays out. And you can see the calm and understanding of a situation. And you can then take that back. And I've had several conversations with my team saying, next time there's an IT system failure, we need to be more like them, because they deal with a crisis in a different way, much more methodical. They know how they're working through it. Whereas the general play when an IT system problem is, either everyone huddles around a machine or a virtual machine, panicking about what the problem is going to be, or there's just mad panic because we need to solve the problem as quickly as possible. And it's just, let's take the venom and emotion out of it and let's work on correcting the issue. And then we'll work out with the RCA and everything else afterwards about what the problem was. But there's straight away, the way I've learned is just try and take that emotion out and stop focusing on why it's happened and whose fault it is, and work on how do we correct this for the users so that they're not seeing this issue.
You're completely right. It's taking the fuel out of it. It's diffusing the situation, to use the burning analogies to that extreme. It's exactly that. It's seeing it for what it's worth and looking at the mitigations of how to rectify it as quickly as possible with a calm head on. And exactly as you say, something without panicking and raising your voice and stuff. And I was going to say, actually, again, with communication, sometimes the way that it is communicated in the first place can cause panic. If someone is screaming and whatever, then that can automatically cause a panicky situation, even though actually it might actually be quite minor. So it's the communication at the start that actually may well affect how it is initially perceived and how the first wave of how it's then actioned may actually be done, even though it may not necessarily need that level of escalation.
Yeah, I've seen that work both ways. I've seen things that are actually major come in as just gone, oh, by the way, this thing doesn't work and nothing really being taken seriously about it until someone came in running around like literally their hair was on fire, to keep that analogy going. Simon's got that problem already.
Yeah, it's already happened. It's
Yeah.
singed. I was going to say, I mean, it sometimes comes down to, you talk about someone coming in shouting their heads off. It sometimes panic increases the more senior the person is that's shouting about it. And to go back to an example David mentioned earlier about someone senior saying there was a problem with the system at home, I think he said, I've experienced that where the CEO or someone on the board has had an issue in the app that actually was quite minor, but it stopped them from doing what they needed to do. So what would have usually have come in as a P3, P4 came in as a P1 urgent must fix now because the CEO had raised it. And suddenly that caused panic. And the team are going, well, why are we fixing this? It's been on the backlog for months and we realized it wasn't important. Well, the CEO's seen it now, so therefore we have to fix it and show that we're going to do all the work we can to make sure the CEO's happy. And that just, again, it's not a crisis in what we would call a crisis as far as an issue that we would fight a fire for, but it's suddenly being forced on us because someone senior has had an issue.
We had a CEO of one of the tech companies I worked for that had a process that escalations go to him, and he would then demand responses from teams within 24 hours. And anything minor that any customer had would go to him, and then it would be the world ending. And everyone treated it like it was world ending. And people were scared, and I wasn't one of those people most of the time, to just say it's not relevant, or it's actually affecting 2 customers and it's got a workaround that's reasonable, and so on, and that we don't have to drop everything, run around like headless chickens to fix this one thing. Every customer is important, don't get me wrong, but there's a practicality of running a business that if you looked at Facebook, Amazon, certain bugs get fixed, ones that impact usability, accessibility, money more than anything else, profitability. If it impacts those things, it will be on fire. But if it's actually just, there's a slight thing for one user account that doesn't quite do something, they will try and fix those things, I'm sure, but they won't actually stop everything else to do it. And that's sometimes the case, is that you have to stop engineering teams to fix problems, and it's not always a good idea. Bigger companies have more teams.
No, I would agree. There are quite a few examples of small startups that completely are at the whim of the customer base. They fix the problems that the customers come up with because they might not have a testing strategy behind it, because they haven't got the ability, the understanding of how to actually do that and produce a quality product. And so therefore they're fixing these problems as they go along, but they're obviously building in technical debt because actually it suddenly becomes unstable. And so therefore potentially they could well fail because they've just been reactionary rather than actually having a process and thinking it through.
It's a hard thing as well, isn't it, to move from being reactive to being proactive and actually having the capacity to turn something that can be quite negative and have quite a big mental, let alone business impact on your teams and your company, into an opportunity where you're being proactive and you're leading those things. And especially in bigger organizations, that turnaround can be incredibly slow. I know we always speak about like how testers want to change that narrative from being the bearers of bad news to looking at things as an opportunity to turn things around. But in these firefighting situations, that can be quite difficult when your business is potentially facing huge losses or missed deadlines that are worth a lot of things. We talked a bit about how the tone is set, and context is kind of everything in this, and understanding the world in which we live. And often we can find ourselves in situations where maybe we don't know the full context of these things. And we have to be very careful about how we act as leaders, that we don't make those assumptions and that we try to paint that picture, because it's the responsible thing to do is to behave in a way that is appropriate without alarming people, but also applying that pragmatic decision turnaround approach.
Yeah, as a leader, I think one of the things I try and do is get facts. So start trying to translate from opinions of the world's on fire to actually, right, how many people are called in? Right, what does the CPU look like? Right, how many errors are we getting in logs? What's the actual reality versus the panic? And try and, what's the normal calls like versus now? Are people successfully in the app versus not? I've had that before. It's like, no one get in the app. Looking at the stats and the metrics, there's 80% of our normal traffic's in that app. So we've got a problem, but it's 20%, not 100. And that allows you to start sharing the narrative, which then starts to change the panic. And it is about trying to kind of be a calmness in a storm which you will get swept into the storm. You can't, completely detach yourself from it. But it's just, as a tester, I like to think we're quite scientific the way we investigate bugs and problems. And I think that attitude helps us go, right, what could have gone wrong here? Right, what's the actual impact versus what's the noise? And we're good at that sort of analysis. Not perfect by all stretch.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I've certainly lived examples where the configuration, the setup of this machine that has the problem, the panic is straight away, oh, well, that means everyone's got this issue. And actually you then look at it, well, no, actually, whether it be the other apps that are in working with it or the configuration setup means actually, no, this is quite a minor situation. It's not a significant issue, but we still need to fix it. But like you said, it's 20% of the user base rather than all 100%. So that straight away, but it's usually through someone with a sort of inquisitive mindset that goes in and goes, well, hang on a minute, this is a specific setup here that's caused this, rather than that, it's going to blat everyone's machine.
So we said about staying calm, and that's important. But is there a danger when you're staying calm and pragmatic and blah, 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 that people can think that means you don't care?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, 100%. Sometimes it's about airing enough of a voice concern that you give people the impression that you do care, but also having that calmness that shows that you're dealing with it without panicking. And that getting that balance right can sometimes be quite difficult.
It's explaining why as you go, isn't it, as well? Say, like why are we trying to get this data? Why are we trying to do this? Why are we trying to understand the domain of it? And I think most of those sort of production bug defects, people understand that context once you start giving it to it. But you've got to kind of explain that as you go, because otherwise, as you say, they can assume things. But also, the same applies. We're talking a lot about like live incidents, those sorts of situations, deployments. To the other side of things, like projects are wrong and all those setups are wrong, or you're not got the right people in the right place at the right time. Again, it's still about explaining the why, because you can't turn back time. It's a fact of life. Time goes in one direction, as far as we know. But let's not go into time. You've got to be able to kind of explain, well, why can we do this better? Make sure lessons are learned from it. Don't repeat your same things. It's more frustrating for me when you start repeating the same mistakes, and educating people, explaining the why this is a bad idea, and taking that time to kind of support others. And I mean that as I truly mean support, because actually that's what we've got to do. It's not telling people off for doing stupid things. It's about creating a positive culture of like, look, okay, we're in a hole. We'll work together to get out of the hole. Can we look at how we prevent this hole?
That finger pointing thing can be something that's a really toxic part in a culture, can it? I mean, we obviously want root cause and understanding, but in cultures where people feel terrified to speak out, and where it's sort of modeled and demonstrated to people that we blame people all the time. Sometimes, have you ever worked with anyone that's referred to as a bit sort of Teflon, where nothing sticks to them, very good at deflecting things?
Yeah. Yep.
I would suggest that if you have people like that in your organization, there's a bit of toxicity, a bit of a red flag in that situation, because they've obviously had to do that to survive within their own organization. And look, we need to find out why things go on. But if we have a culture where blame is found very quickly on people immediately, that's not great. So blame probably does need to be correctly attributed at certain times in certain circumstances. But there's a flip side with this, right? Isn't there? There's also like, we work really hard, but it always feels quite a negative grind, and we forget to celebrate success, which is the complete flip side, where it's just you've just done your job. That's what you're paid to do. So why do we need to celebrate that success with you?
I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because lots of our examples have been how we cope with it in the situation. But Russell and just now Chris has highlighted the point of actually learning from your mistakes, actually doing retrospectives, really looking at the issues around it, the cause, what was the breakdown in the process. Try and do it without blaming people or individuals, because actually that doesn't really, again, echoing Chris's point, isn't great for the culture. But I would argue that I wouldn't necessarily say if someone is described as Teflon, it may not necessarily be the culture of the current company. It might be the culture of the company that they came from before, that they felt they have to be like that. So don't always assume that it's in the current company that is the case.
Well, I've got another assumptions one for you, David.
Go on.
Henry Winkler said assumptions are the termites of relationships.
Thanks for that nugget. The other thing is actually, again, with Chris, thinking about the successes, make sure that the people in that crisis when they're fighting fires, the things, the people that did well out of it, the people that did remain calm, but were able to maintain that communication to explain exactly what was happening, should be called out for a good process, or highlighting how the success came about, if it did. Because actually, without those sort of people, then things could get excessively worse.
Like I say, we talked about avoiding blame, but to Chris's point earlier, I think you do need to have some accountability as individuals, yourself, if that makes any sense. You don't necessarily attribute blame to somebody else, but there's something you could have done better. Be open, be okay with that fact. We all make mistakes.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean crucify yourself, to be very clear. I've had people in my teams that knew there was a risk, didn't make a test for that risk, and then it went wrong in production. And they really, there was a root cause analysis of it, and they just basically said it was my fault constantly. It's like, no, there's multiple factors at play here. The fact you didn't do the test was a way to catch it, but that still you didn't make it not work. There was lots of other factors at play here that we all have a part to play in it. That test would have caught it, yes, but actually we should have prevented it, not caught it anyway.
That's that whole team ownership, whole team owning of those things, but also that spirit of continuous improvement, right? I don't think we ever feel that something that's done is really fully 100% perfect. When I worked in the computer game industry, if I ever saw a game that was scored 100% for being awesome, I always thought that was a bit wrong. I think there's always room for improvement no matter what we do. And what we have to do is be pragmatic in our work about, is this good enough? What can we do next to make it better?
But highlighting again Russell's point about sort of individuals taking it upon themselves, we as managers need to make sure that we diffuse that situation and make sure that we ourselves don't blame people, but also make sure that it's a collective, exactly as you said, Russell, blame, not an individual.
A lot of it's language. It's
Yeah,
the language
totally.
we use in doing it.
Communication, yeah.
If we say it's such fault or someone did something wrong, then we are apportioning blame without meaning it.
And it's different for different audiences, right, as well, because different cultures, different audiences, different people will attribute these things differently. There's not like a one way that's going to work for everybody. And it's incumbent on you, if you're in a leadership position, to understand your people and your culture to make sure that you are appropriately presenting that information and the investigation and the striving to improve things, because different cultures, different people, different perspectives, we've all got different baggage, like we said about the Teflon person. We all come from different places and different things, and we need to take time, know your people. If you don't know the people you're working with, you're not going to be able to collaborate and communicate well with those people. Take the time to learn and understand those people will give you the tools to be able to better communicate and better deal with all of these situations as and when they arise. Let's face it, they're always going to turn up at some point, but we can use our informed experiences to hopefully mitigate as many of them as we can and learn from them and be better prepared as and when they do happen.
The thing about communication and the blame culture is, again, the way that you communicate it is rather than taking it sort of personally and saying you or I, you can take the blame, but use more subtle language like we. So we take ownership, but it's a collective ownership rather than an individual ownership. And again, it's all down to communication.
And I guess company culture and the way those things do, because like we can go on for hours and talk about things like how goals and OKRs can inform the way people behave and do blah blah blah. But it is culture, it is individuals and teams. But the way the company's culture, it sets that tone. Your leadership folks above you may well have a certain tone and things, and that can really inform the way people behave, because maybe they're desperate to get that promotion, that pay rise, that bonus, to look good themselves because they understand how they're being measured. Those things can also not be helpful in times when we're fighting fires because people are trying to protect themselves.
You're absolutely right. And there is scenarios and there are companies out there, or there are teams within companies out there where the feeling is that they're constantly firefighting because the culture of that team is that the leader or whoever has put the pressure on the team that it's constantly a panic. Constantly everything needs to be done yesterday, and the team are constantly feeling that pressure of, we need to get this done, and they're running around like headless chickens trying to work out what the right solution is. And as a leader, one of the most important things you can do is protect your team from that kind of panic and not cause it within your team. And if you can suppress the flames by not adding petrol to it, that helps calm the team and bring it all down, rather than being the one that's igniting it every time because you have a decision that you need to do something, and therefore you're going to put it all on the team to make sure they feel the pain as well. It's a real challenge when you're in that environment to try and figure out how to solve the problem.
That's the art of leadership, I guess. Like, if we're going to use this fire analogy, keep going. If you've had to do fire training, you'll know about kind of extinguishers. There's a different type of extinguisher for the different fire. Different problems need different solutions. And some things, if you put the wrong thing on, will make it worse. If you pour petrol on a fire, that's generally bad. Part of leadership is understanding and learning. And a lot of that learning is done on the job. Now, I would love there to be a kind of a fire extinguisher guide. And as Chris puts the sign up saying context, a fire extinguisher guide to help you figure out what context to use, what type of solution for firefighting. Because I think that would be very useful. And there is a talk idea for somebody.
Absolutely. And I think on that final point, it's probably time to put the flames out now and bring this discussion to a close. So thank you everyone for a really, really good discussion. I think we've covered quite a lot of ground with the firefighting analogy at least. So yes, thank you everyone. Thank you to Saffron QA for continuing to sponsor us. And if you want to reach out to us, please check out on the socials, LinkedIn, Twitter. We're on Blue Sky now as well, I believe, which Chris has managed. I've still not managed to log into Blue Sky yet, so I need to do that at some point. If you want to support us, we do still have a Patreon. We do still aim to try and update that at some point and see if we can entice more sponsors, supporters. But that's something for another day. So thank you again, everyone, and we'll speak to you again next time. For now, it's goodbye from the testing peers.
Goodbye.